Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Funder's Perspective, a conversation about innovation, iteration. Okay. Good morning. Sorry about that. So from the Funder's Perspective, a conversation about innovation, iteration, and sustainability. So as you can see, we have Paula Marincola here, who is live from Philadelphia. She couldn't join us in person today. So it's important that we are very quiet in the room so that she can hear us well. And also, at the end of the session, if there's any questions and answer, all the sessions are recorded. So it's important that you either will repeat the question or I'll come around and with a free mic so that you can ask the question and it's on tape. On that note, I'll let Jeffrey make the introductions.
So good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Just some housekeeping to start off with. The session today, we're going to kind of start off with a moderated discussion up here, but what we really want to do is leave ample time and space for dialogue among everyone in the room. So as we are kind of starting off and setting the tone with some of these questions, if you have questions, make sure to kind of keep them in mind because we will give people the opportunity to really engage around some of these topics. And so the genesis for this this session this morning, and thanks to everyone who's been involved, but really is a response to the shifting world around us and the fact that a culture of innovation has really started to permeate through the cultural sector, and so as museums and cultural institutions really struggle to kind of begin to deal with some of these issues like iteration and scale and sustainability. Now's really the time to engage with our partners on the philanthropic side to try and figure out how we can really substantively address a lot of this. So really thankful to have Paula Marincola from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage here, Chris Barr from the Knight Foundation, and Lisa Schermerhorn from Crest. And rather than me read bios, I think maybe it would be great for each of our panelists to take 2 minutes or so, whatever, and talk to us a little bit about their organization, and so we can really understand the lens that they're all approaching this conversation this morning through. So, Paula, would you start?
I knew you were going to ask me to start. I hope the technology gods are kind to us today. So I'm the executive director of the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage in Philadelphia. We're a multidisciplinary grant maker, funding in the 5-county Philadelphia region. We are locally based, but the work that we support has both regional, national, and international relevance. So we're also like to think of ourselves as a hub for knowledge sharing around issues that are critical to cultural practice. So we organize a lot of events, symposia, lectures. We have a visiting artist program, and we produce publications. So that's the center.
Hi, I'm Chris Barr from the Knight Foundation, director of our Technology Innovation Program. Knight Foundation was started as a foundation focused on journalism. Since then, we've built arts programs and community programs in 8 focus cities around the country. Our museum tech work has recently ramped up and started to do some work nationally, and so my program, the Technology Innovation Program, in coordination with our arts program, has been overseeing the technology work, and really this all comes out of what we saw happen to the journalism field in the last decade and the challenges that they've had with digital transformation in that field, and thinking about the other fields that we really care about and want to help ensure get a head start on transforming in the digital age.
Hi, is this on?
Should turn it on.
I'm Lisa Schermerhorn, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Crest Foundation. Yeah. Is that good enough? Yes, okay. And the Crest Foundation is based in New York, and we support things related to art history, art conservation, and the art museum professions. And have an even narrower focus than that on things related to European pre-modern work. So from antiquity to the pre-modern era is our focus. About 8 years ago, we began a program called the Digital Resources for the History of Art, and in a systematic way have been funding technology initiatives both within the Academy and museums. 50% of our activity throughout the whole foundation are fellowships, and the other 50% are grants. So we're really interested in supporting the professional development of art historians, conservators, and museum educators and curators.
Great, thank you all for being a part of this. It's awesome that we have such a diverse group up here, kind of whether it's hyper kind of local work or specialized subject matter work. I think it's good to have a wide point of view. So I want to start off by asking Paula a question. On a recent planning call, Paula, let me look at my notes here. It says, quote, you stopped using the word innovation. Even the word is problematic. Can you explain a little bit that notion of why innovation is problematic for you, and why you don't even use the word anymore?
Well, we sometimes use the word, but we stopped using it as a directive. I think we found it to be overused in the sector. It was beginning to be a buzzword that was almost meaningless in some ways, or very imprecisely used. So we decided, and with due respect to innovation, because it's important, that we would use instead the word imagination, right? We thought that was fresher and more engaging.
Could you repeat that word? I think it got lost.
Imagination.
Imagination.
Yeah. Which, as I say, we thought was fresher and more engaging and more open. It suggested a lot of possibility to us. We also use the idea of self-reflection. We really encourage our applicants to really question the assumptions that underlie their programmatic choices and really try to stretch them on business as usual, so while staying true to their mission. So I think what we're trying to foster is an attitude of inquiry and constructive critique, creativity, and all of this could be a distinction without a difference. But that's where we are.
Thanks, Paula. Chris, Lisa, are you noticing similar trends in your organizations about innovation?
Do you want to jump in? Sure. I have opinions.
So do I. Yeah, I personally agree that it's a very problematic word. It's overused, misused, and we rarely use it at the foundation. Our grantees include museums, and I think that they've done a lot of work adapting to changes and done that responsibly, and it's been resourceful and creative and novel, but is it always innovative when it's called innovative? I don't know. So one technology industry analyst has a definition that I find really helpful, and his name is Horace Daydew, and I might be butchering the pronunciation name, but he describes innovation as a series of nested rings, and the outer ring is innovation. At the core of that is novelty, and a novelty is something that's new, like the rose gold color of an iPhone. Encircling novelty is a creation, and a creation is novel, but it also brings value. And it's so a painting, a piece of journalism, and it's something that can be copyrighted. And then encircling a creation is an invention, and it's novel and it's also creative, but it has the added layer of utility, and that's something that can be patented. And then encompassing all of them is innovation. And he defines it as something that's actually a systemic change. So something like FedEx's distribution system. So there's no legal protection for it, like a creation or an invention, but there's market competition. And that's that's a little narrow for this context, perhaps, but I think where it's useful is the rarity with which he uses it, and and that has impact on how resources are spent. So if something is novel versus an innovation, the way staff time and dollars within a museum will be spent will be different. I was at there's someone from IMLS here, but I was at a convening of IMLS back in October, and they are swapping the word innovation and now using impact. And they said that they had reviewed their innovation grants and saw that actually what they had funded, and this is their word, were a series of novelties. And they were not having the systemic change within their systems and environments that they support to amount to what they'd hoped. So now their focus is on impact. And this isn't, at Crest, we actually don't use this language at all. But I think Horace Dédue's conception of it is helpful. You know?
Thanks. Chris, your opinions?
Yeah, so I would agree with all this. Unfortunately, I'm also the guy that works in a department called technology innovation. So I'm saddled with that. And when I talk about innovation, it's along very similar lines, which is how do we create new things and approaches that create value? And oftentimes we think of the novelties when related to innovation because we see so many things under that banner that don't actually create value. And really, the value creation and the subsequent value capture, right? So if you're creating value for someone, how do you recapture some of that value for your institution is really the hard part, right? That's what really gets us to innovation. The other thing that I think about when we talk about innovation that's problematic, especially when we're running grant programs, is we often say we're looking for the most innovative work, we're looking for innovators. And people don't necessarily self-identify as innovators. Like, hi, I don't say, hi, I'm Chris Barr, an innovator. That would be odd. But at the same time, we need more people working and experimenting and doing the new work that's going to create value to our organizations and move us into the ways that we work in the future. Within our own organization, I think I see a lot of fetishization of innovations, thinking of innovation in the sense of nouns, right? And the thing that I try to push internally, and I just keep trying to walk up this hill, is to think about innovation as a verb, right? So as a verb. So how does our organization, how do our institutions build the muscles to try new things, to learn from them, to act in new ways that will increasingly return value to the organization through things that weren't here before you started?
Oh, man. So yeah, this notion of value, I think, is very important. And I attended a session yesterday with Kendra Jones from Radley Projects. It was very good. But one thing that she said yesterday really struck with me, and it was do not innovate narrowly. And she said, innovate with processes, innovate with business models. Not, when we think of innovation, a lot of times it's the shiny thing, right? The novelty. And so, as we innovate and strive to create value through things like processes or non-novelties, there come aspects of risk involved there, right? And so, Chris, I'm wondering, but by its nature, risks and uncertainty are involved with a lot of this. How might funders help museums kind of start to operationalize the process of taking calculated risks?
So when I was brought on to Knight Foundation 5 years ago, I was hired to run an initiative called the Knight Prototype Fund, which is exactly what it sounds like, an initiative to fund early stage investment. These are extremely risky things. Sometimes we're funding things that were just a back of the napkin sketch at that point. What what we were learning from were sort of failures at larger investments, where we were funding technology at a large scale. Let's say we were doing a $250,000 grant to a new piece of technology. And one of the things we saw happen quite often were our grantees would go into that project, they'd received funding to do this thing, and then they went heads down. They built. Maybe this is a 2 or 3 year grant. And at the end of the 2 or 3 years, they came back up and they said, okay, we built the thing. But it turns out nobody wanted it. And what was happening at the same time 5 years ago was sort of in the commercial world, we saw, the lean startup and these sort of MVP models for building new things that were really about how do we build the least that we can and start to verify that we're building the right thing early on. We started putting our grantees through human-centered design training. We made smaller, faster grants. These were 6-month grants to build a prototype, which is really fast and demanding for a lot of grantees. But at the same time that they were building a thing, whether or not that thing failed, they were also building these muscles that I talked about. They were learning how to build something quickly, put it in front of people, learn from it, make mistakes, pivot and try something else. So I think, if we are starting this work, yes, we want to get to where we're innovating our large-scale business models and organizations and those sorts of things. But I say start small first, right? You have to start to build these muscles with things that if they fail, it's not a big deal, but we know how to do it next time. And I think especially what I've seen within museums, one of the challenges is built into the culture is that we have a culture where we're spending years building something that's perfect, right? We're making an exhibition, we plan it years in advance, we make it, no one sees it until opening night. And so how does a technology workflow where we're putting really rough stuff in front of people, where it's going to break, where we're going to learn from that and make the next better version, how does that culture exist within that larger museum culture? And that's what we're starting to think about and as we work with museums.
Thanks. Paula, is failure ever okay from a funder's perspective?
We say it is. I think we all have to live with it. I forgot to mention when I was talking about the center initially that we fund in a few different ways. The majority of our funds, though, go to project support. We also do fellowships and organizational development. And we talk about our project grants as risk capital. So, but we want that risk to be informed. So we work really hard with our grantees and our applicants, and we're very hands-on as a grants maker because we're in this community. And, they have to really do their homework for any big idea or even small, but, substantive idea that they're bringing to us for potential support. So, have they thought it through? Do they have the best possible players involved for what it is they're trying to do? How does it stretch their mission but remain, true to the mission? Because I agree, novelty for novelty's sake is really not helpful or effective for organizational sustainability. To whom are you speaking in the projects that we look at? To whom is the grantee speaking? We're very audience-centric, so we're always trying to get our applicants to be really specific about the audiences that they're targeting and what they hope to bring to them and how they hope to engage with them. So, I think of failure as complacency and institutional laziness, and but not the opposite of success, if that makes any sense. So, failure is something we live with, and it's okay. I think the project has been managed in really good faith. If the organization, the grantee, has done the work, that the outcomes will be important and something to be learned from, regardless of whether it's a success or a failure. Yeah.
I agree. But I would say Crest's funding approach is a little bit like what Chris is starting to do. I mean, we place small bets. The size of our grants are comparatively small to Pew and Knight and to many other foundations. So we're willing to take risk, but it's an informed risk. You know, we're working with smart, talented people. They've got a reputation. They have a track record. Even if that may not be deep track record, we're willing to experiment. But it's done in an informed way. And so, and we don't look at things in terms of success or failure, really. You know, a small project that maybe didn't have the outcome that a grantee or we were anticipating doesn't necessarily mean it was a failure. I was actually trying to think of something that was a failure, and in our digital program, and there hasn't been. You know, outcomes may have not been as anticipated, but it wasn't, you know, ever a straight up. I mean, I don't even know what that would be for us. You know, but we do support. You know, and because we're a small funder, we might invest a little bit of money that then would be a proof of concept for a larger funder to come in and do a sustained multi-year grant for them for a project. So we're willing to be that initial support that might gather others around a project.
So the sort of dichotomy between success and failure, I think, is a weird one. Through the Prototype Fund, we've funded about 250 projects. And the ones that bother me more than the just spectacular failures, like that just explode, are the ones that just sort of keep going along with just okay success. And it takes energy to keep something running that's just okay. And where else could that energy go, right? Could that energy, if you just decide, you know, this is just doing okay for us, it's not really getting us anywhere, it's not really, it doesn't have a growth ramp that looks very good. If you killed that, where could you put the human capital, time, and energy into the next thing? And I think that's one of the hard things for large institutions to think about, especially in terms with innovation. We can't be constantly additive, right, without stopping to do some of the things. So if we want to do the innovative work, how do we make the hard decisions about what we're not doing in order to do that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I have had some conversations about the evolving nature of all this and the fact that, you know, technology or digital is really never done. It either gets better or it should die, right? And so I'm wondering, we tend, as museums, we have like that notion of continuation or continuing progress, or you know, kind of involves onboarding new skill sets and onboarding new expertise and internalizing a lot of that. Is it time to start, rather than outsourcing to agencies sometimes, is it time to start thinking about supporting internal capacity, fostering internal capacity at that level, do you think?
I'm going to say yes, because we're working on a grant program to do just that, actually, to help on the staffing side within museums in our 9 cities. It's hard to do technology work if you don't have technologists, and it's quite expensive to just always hire out this work. I think if you looked at your budget and what it costs to get a single app built, would you get more benefit from just hiring a single developer who's going to understand your entire infrastructure, who's going to build things that are going to last a lot longer? I think yes. It's hard to do this work without people who understand tech.
Let's talk about open source and collaboration.
Chris, in the Knight Foundation most recent round of museum and technology project funding, there are several museum teams that share everything from process decision research, data collection to coding. Do you feel that projects that contribute to open source community, whether through transparency or published codes, add value to these projects?
So open source is a tricky one. Knight Foundation we often have a clause in our grant agreement that requires open source on certain projects, and we even have a favorite license. Open source is quite a commitment, though, and this idea that if we put it out open source, magically a community is going to build up around it is typically wrong. I've been on some open source dev teams myself. And it's usually one guy, right, who keeps that thing moving, one guy or girl who really just is driving that project. What I do think about in the museum space specifically, one, if we don't have technologists that can handle the sysadmin work required to get an open source product up and running within your internal space, that's really challenging. The museums I've talked to, most of the small and mid-sized folks are looking for turnkey solutions, and putting your Ruby code on GitHub is not going to help them do that. So how do we think about open source projects that maybe also have a SaaS option, or there's a way to get them easily up and running on a development environment? How do we think about how we resource through consortia and other models to get more people using these open source products is important. But I do think open source is important because at the same time we have a deficit of technologists within the space. We're not in a position where we can actively compete with each other. There's a need for cooperation because if we're going to win at the technology game, we have to pool resources.
Question for Paula. I've been spending some time in Philadelphia with the Pew, learning a lot about your processes. And one of the most interesting aspects to what you're doing is a concept called thinking partners, where you pair an external expert with your grantees. And I'm wondering how that's going and what you see, what benefits you see from thinking partners on the kind of atypical projects that you support.
So again, thinking partners are a way to help our applicants get beyond habitual modes of thinking, right? Often many of our organizations are small, the staffs are small, there's not a lot of turnover, and even among the larger organizations, sometimes it's static in terms of personnel, which is not a bad thing in and of itself at all. But we're trying to provoke some new thinking on the part of our applicants, and we think that the thinking partners have brought fresh eye and a fresh mind to really, it's a resource, it's a capacity building resource, and we have them in different ways, but the thinking partner is really about a sympathetic but somewhat removed interlocutor who can really help you or help an applicant think more imaginatively, to go back to that word, and maybe more substantively, sometimes open up a new network of collaborators potentially. So we're pretty committed to it, and I must say that sometimes the applicants have resisted because it's like, well, we know what we want to do. Why do we need somebody else to do? But in general, after the process has gone on, I think everyone has found it to be pretty valuable. So we try to walk our own talk, as you know. I mean, partly what Jeff is doing with us, he's a visiting practitioner, part of our visiting artist program, and he's spending, Jeff, almost a year with us on and off, working with our constituents and our applicants and with us related to technology and how to use it in an imaginative and in a substantial way. So we try to be porous to the thinking of those outside of our immediate Bollywood, especially cultural practitioners, because Grantmakers can be very far removed from practice, and we try to stay close.
Just to finish on open source and collaboration, Lisa, one area of focus for Crest is supporting digital resources that further scholarship and access to collection. So how important is it to Crest that the digital resources that are created through its grants be open and accessible to scholars and organizations throughout the sector?
Hugely important. It's hugely important. We also have language in our grant agreement about when it's applicable, the code being open source, and we do have a Creative Commons license we also like to. But it's not, it's a challenging thing to maintain. We do, I can think of a handful of projects that we've supported for some of the people actually in this room, that part of the appeal for Crest had been that there was a way for, there was a life beyond the constituent that was developing it, for it to be shared with the community more broadly as a system, as a workflow, or actual code to be developed. And I think in general, our ethos is one of generating access for almost everything that we do. So the resources that we help digitize to put online, we want to make sure that they're freely available. That's it in our DNA, really.
So we want to get to Q&A, but before we do, I want to touch on sustainability and solvency for a lot of this, and I guess maybe throw out a question for all three panelists here. What are some ways that you all have seen cultural institutions, be they museums, libraries, or even funding agents themselves, start to operationalize these things and as part of the fabric of what we do? And thinking partners is one of the ways, but I'm curious as to how have you seen on your side of things successful operationalization of this?
Nobody wants to go.
Maybe the answer is no.
Sure. So
That's why we're here, right?
So I've been working with museums for only about a year now, but I'll give an example of, and maybe this is a bit apples and oranges because we're talking about a nonprofit with about 100 employees versus a large brick and mortar. But my example through Grantmakers and Knight Foundation is StoryCorps. Probably most of you know StoryCorps. You hear it. I switch it off on Fridays because I don't want to cry before I go to work when it comes on NPR. But StoryCorps came to us a few years ago and said, hey, we want to develop an app to help people share stories through their phones. And this was something we granted through our prototype fund, a small $35,000 grant. But as part of it, we sent them through human-centered design training. They started to they just really embraced it as a team. And one of the things that I always love is when people come back from this training, getting these emails like, hey, Chris, we really loved the training. We started to use it. Oh, yeah, not on your project, but on this other project. And I'm like, all right, great. That's the kind of organizational impact we're looking for. They started to use it. They prototyped. They gained a lot of traction. They hired a design and development firm to help them reach a product that could actually scale. They got it onto phones and have had over 350,000 people sign up to use it. They've had hundreds of thousands of stories, and they're actually getting more stories through the app now than they are from their sort of setting up the StoryCorps booths throughout the country. Part of that is a big marketing push through their great Thanksgiving Listen. Get ready for that. Get the app and get your family to tell some stories. But not only did they through that success, they started to implement human-centered design processes in the other work that they're doing. They started to connect their technological infrastructure. So they had an archive here that was stuff coming from the app. They had an archive over here that was stuff that was coming. They've combined those. They've now made that all public. They've just launched actually a public archive where you can literally listen to everything that they've ever recorded. Previously, that was all locked up in the Library of Congress, and you had to actually go to the Library of Congress to find those recordings. So this is an organization that was very analog in a lot of ways, collected stories, went to physical places, and then sent them to the Library of Congress, that is now build an underlying technological infrastructure that they're built off and innovation practices that will help build out their next iterations.
Cool. So we're gonna jump to Q&A. Yeah, I have one from Twitter actually, and this one is for I guess for the panel. But if, as Lisa says, the funding model is shifting towards small bets on informed risk, I'd like to get a sense of how each of the funders go about the informed part. What does the research look like?
Well, I wouldn't say funding model writ large is making this shift. I mean, I think we all have different approaches, and if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. Kind of like a museum, we're all snowflakes. But you know, I mean, I think part of being informed, you know, attending. So for the Crest Foundation, we started this program and got engaged in this community about 8 years ago. Part of it is having our ear to the ground, getting to know people in the community, hearing what people need, who are the players, what are they doing. You know, I mean, that's part of it. You know, but I wouldn't say. I think that's characteristic of Crest. It's not. It's certainly not characteristic of many of my funding peers who work at a much different level than we do.
Sorry, Paula, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I can talk about it a little bit. I mean, it's a good question. The informed risk needs to be on both sides, for sure, of the equation. We try really hard to stay in touch with what is happening in cultural practice. We have a huge network that we've developed over 20 years or more of centers, producers, artists, curators, museum professionals, etc., that we call on in a regular way to refresh our own knowledge. We have a band of staff here that we call specialists because they're special. No, they're content specialists, right? So their job is to stay informed about certain areas of the arts and the humanities. And they are there to resource us and our applicants in our conversations around potential projects. So, you know, and then you have to be intellectually omnivorous. You have to be curious. You have to want to find out, you know, you have to want to know what's the next thing and who's doing it and how are they doing it and who's doing it successfully, and not just in large organizations, but across the whole ecology of practice. And it's great work. I mean, it's great work, and that's the way we try to approach it. As Lisa said, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation, because we all have our separate desires and methodologies and priorities, right? Our strategic priorities are varied.
I think one of the things that Grantmakers consistently do is ask you to do a really hard thing. We want you to, one, level up your organization, but we are also simultaneously asking you to be advancing the field. And I think a lot of people that are working within institutions they're thinking about how do we get the institution to the next level, not how do we move the field of museums simultaneously. So it's a large bar. You know, as we're evaluating grants, we're looking at a lot of things. We're looking at how do you understand the problem area and what else exists as solutions within that problem area? How well do you understand the people that you're trying to serve. What evidence do you have that there's a desire for the thing that you're trying to make? How will you, through the project, learn if you're right about your initial assumptions and hypothesis? And what sort of model have you put in place to help sustain this thing in the case that you are right?
Questions? Let's go here first. This is a great panel. And Chris, I like some of the things you touched on. Chris, with the SA, with the software service reference, as well as I think so many of the projects that I think are really exciting are often the one person projects, and that one person leaves the institution and there's no institutional support for that, and then it's dead. And I'm just wondering, when you look at those types of innovative projects, and many of them, there's graveyards filled with those. Do you have ideas as to how foundations can change their model for funding to avoid those types of pitfalls? I just came out of looking at the museum stat, IMLS funded museum stat program, which I thought was an interesting model, just because they are providing it as a service and at the same time having all the data available to the membership if people want to do more with that. But I'm thinking, are there more models like that you can think of that are less about handing the money to an individual or for a short period of time?
There are companies, right? I think there's a need for innovation within the vendor field as well, right? And there's a need for the museum field to be able to put leverage on these companies that serve them to be building products that serve their needs better. For one, that's right. That's a sustainability model, is their ability to build thriving companies. One of the things we did last year was fund a museum technology track through New Inc. At the new museum, and part of the reason we did that is we keep seeing this demand for those turnkey solutions, and I'm not convinced that's what museums are in the business of doing, is setting up a SaaS platform that other museums benefit from. I don't personally know enough about the consortium space and whether there's folks who can support that in the long run. I know that if you look at the library field, there's quite a bit of that. But to get to products that everyone in the field can agree, yes, this is a thing that we need, and it looks pretty much the same for everyone, is a really tricky space. So I think there also needs to be a thinking about technology within the museum space where folks are able to see there's an underlying infrastructure that we can build boutique experiences on top of, because museums care deeply about creating an audience experience that is unique to their institution. But that doesn't mean we have to reinvent and build new software every time we come to the same problem. So how do we build robust technology that we can share and build unique experiences on top of it? I think as a field, we need to come together and start to answer those questions.
Thank you all again for this panel. This is fantastic. My name is Mitch Sava, and I am the VP of Innovation. So I'm not ready to give up on the word, go innovation, for a mid-sized science center. And I've only been at the museum and in the industry for about a year. I came from the commercial sector, so I come from a lot of the things you were just talking about, Chris, human-centered design, lean and agile approaches, particularly as they've been used or applied in corporates. And I was brought into my museum to try and bring some of that flavor to help us reimagine our science center and the science center field for the future, for the next, addressing all of the challenges that we're looking at these days. And one of the challenges I've had internally now as part of the industry is on the funding and the grant side, that a lot of the traditional funders that we as an institution have been going to are, again, I'm fresh to this space, so this is obvious to everyone else in the room, but this notion of fill out this incredibly long document where you are going to tell us in detail the next 3 years of your plan, right, with a detailed multi-year budget associated with that, essentially asking, for us to de-risk the entire enterprise. And again, I get the notion of homework. I get the notion of having hypotheses that are based upon past observation and understanding. And I don't think these concepts are totally antithetical to what we're trying to do at the museum in a more lean approach. But I've been struggling with it because I'm like, I have an idea. I mean, we see a need. We have an idea to test to address that need. I want to test that with an audience. I want to do that in the next 6 months.
Right.
And I've been struggling to figure out, how do I pull that off? And so recently I've been thinking, I'm sorry, long ramble, but this is the question. So I'm excited to hear that you guys are playing with different types of funding models. I'm really excited to hear that. And I've also been looking more at kind of the world of venture philanthropy and angel investment, which is a world I used to be in, to say, are there angel investors out there who would be interested in applying a similar sort of model to experiments in the social sector? And I'm curious, that's the question. Is that kind of space evolving at all? Are there new models of funding that are emerging to support these sorts of quick experimental types of activity, which could grow into a larger sort of service or product in the future, but you need to test now? I put that to you, all of the panel.
One of the things that I personally am glad that we've been able to do when we started the prototype fund is have an application form with 5 questions limited to like a paragraph worth of text each. Because what we know is anytime we put out an open call, we'll get hundreds of entries. We'll be funding 10 or 20 of those projects. And personally, I don't want to waste a lot of people's time. And then we ask for more information as you get closer to actually receiving a grant. So we don't ask a budget until we think we want to fund it. So I think as funders, we can do that more often. And I think, I'm seeing these trends with a lot of other funders. I know that IMLS has been doing this sort of 2-pager before you move on to further consideration. So I think that trend is happening. On the sort of angel investment side, I've seen some of it happen in the nonprofit space, but this is looking at basically startup organizations, right? Angels that want to fund mission-related, technology-driven startups, right? So now you have startups going through Y Combinator and other incubators like that. But I haven't seen it. What's the harder problem are these large institutions that need big culture shifts, that need to start moving quicker and acting differently. How can investors help those organizations make the changes they need? And that's a really hard problem, and it's not necessarily a thing you can fund, right? It's a thing that requires really smart leadership, and it sounds like you're in an institution that at least was smart enough to hire you and knows that they need this kind of thinking internally.
Paula, did you want to respond to that question?
Well, I'm sympathetic to what the questioner was talking about. We are one of those funders that has a long application, but we also have a letter of intent process that precedes the application, and that is a fairly short 2-pager, where you put forward your idea and a sketchy budget and some indication of why this is urgent for your organization. And that goes to a review panel, and we get their comments back, and we make a sorting, and then we invite organizations to go forward to full application. We do have something called discovery grants at the center, which are really meant to do that, provoke discovery. They're there for organizations or individuals to ask an important question related to their programming and to go through a process of discovery. We don't know where those grants end up, where they come out, but we think they're valuable. And we also have a small capacity building program called No Idea is Too Ridiculous. And,
oh, that's great.
and we actually believe that quick moving. So it's a workshop where teams from different organizations get a very small amount of money, $3,500, sometimes up to $5,000, I think, to implement within 4 or 5 months a new idea and something that they thought they could never, ever do in their organization. And those have been fun for us and fun, I think, for the organizations, and have really built capacity in the community to kind of think imaginatively. I'm not sure if I answered the question very well, but that's sort of where we are in terms of the way we can respond either more quickly or less.
Great. Thank you. Jane?
My question kind of, I kind of agree with you with my frustration when I read those applications. And also, I've been on the side of reading applications, and I know you're going through 20, and sometimes someone just says one word, and you're like, oh, they don't know what they're doing. You know, like, so it's, but, well, one thing that, and this has been talked about for years, but really as museums, we have to figure out the infrastructure, the back end, the standards, getting consortium, that, because making the interactives on top or doing that, to me, that's fun. But when people really ask about, well, what are you doing? I spend a lot of time on, this is our way that we can get it deployed within the museum. Here's how visitor service is going to make sure people, when they walk in, know there's a new thing. This is what, and if you don't have that in place, it doesn't matter what little thing you're building, it's gonna fail. And I know, like, I find it so funny, you come to these talks and no more talking about innovation, don't use the word interactive, no big projects, only little small projects. Like, I find that frustrating. Like, let's think bigger as museums. Let's not waste our energy. Let's build things together in the back end, because then we are gonna personalize. It is about our institutions. Our institutions are very different. But if we had some standards and we really get that going and we get money behind that, I think we have an opportunity to really, like, when I say we share things, I even know that Chris was like, is it open source? I'm always like, I can give open source there. I mean, I believe in it, but most museums are gonna be able to do zero with that. Yeah. Zero. We're gonna show you, like, how did you get the curator at the table? Where are you putting the content? How do you start a prototype when you only have this much money? Like, sharing all that in a real way of your project, I think it's a lot of times more valuable. So I just ranted, but I'm throwing it out to you guys. Do you see that? Or, you know, what's your feelings on that?
I agree, and I think, but it feels like a lot of that would need to come actually from within the museum community, that there would need to be, I don't think a funder should be driving that. I think a way for that ethos to be sustained is it being pushed internally to the museum world, that there's this, I mean, I think funders can help facilitate that, but I think there needs to be, that needs to be driven from the practitioners in the field themselves, not from a funder coming in saying, what you guys really need is...
Oh, no, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But would you fund, like, that requires a lot more money, but with that kind of project where you don't have an outcome that's visible to you applied to interactive, but you've got a group of museums together to really say we're gonna work together to put standards in place and create so all our applications that we can share the same APIs to then, like, we have any person who's going to create something will be able to create it knowing these sort of standards in the back end. And you're not spending a lot of time on how do I get my content to move, or where do I put it, or that's more was my question. I mean, I don't expect you to come in and say you need to do this.
I think other fields do this, right? And again, I think like the museum world needs to look closely at what libraries do. And granted, they have a big head start. The MARC metadata format was invented, I think, in the 1950s, 60s. Like, they knew about data before data was a thing. But that kind of standardization has really allowed for the sort of cross-institutional sharing to exist for a long time within libraries. And they have lots of amazing specialists that think that way, and probably would be a sort of adjacent field that would talk to you about how you get those standards movements happening.
We were, yeah, but it's very hard for them to get other museums to come together to sort of put that together. We work very closely with our library. I mean, we pull all their information. I mean, they're part of all our teams when we do projects. I think it's more of the money that's out there, that there's a real sort of push, like we're giving money towards this sort of thinking. Can 5 institutions come together and really prove that they're going to make a difference, get to where the libraries are?
Well, I think on the collection side, the field needs to push the vendors, right? If you look at what software is managing most of your collections, to my knowledge, is 1 or 2 folks. And if you wanted to say, hey, look, we need interoperability and we need to be able to connect with other museums and we need these kinds of metadata standards to be in our software, you all have the power of bargaining there. But unfortunately, you're bargaining one at a time rather than together.
Maybe we have time for another very, very quick question. We have like a couple of minutes left.
Thanks. Neil Johnson from the Bullock Texas State History Museum. I'm new to Austin, Texas, and discovered their local arts grant program there, which is designed with great purpose to bring you in early with a small $3,000 grant, but they really want to get to know you. If you score highly on that, you graduate to the $5,000 to the $10,000. But they have this goal long term of making you capable of running a $250,000 or $500,000 arts grant. And it's this purpose to get you into this stream and mature you along as you climb this ladder of capability. I'm wondering if you guys are thinking like that as well, about long-term relationships that an institution might start small, but build gradually up to larger and larger capabilities with your help.
Paula, did you hear the question?
I didn't hear it very well, so maybe I shouldn't be the person to respond.
That was one of the reasons that we created the Prototype Fund. It creates a way, a small dollar way for us to get to know someone and if they can deliver on a project before, and we think projects have a natural growth cycle, right? So we think you start at a prototype, you move to a beta stage project, you go to a growth stage and then scale the project from there. So to the best of our ability, we try to move people through that cycle. That being said, funders are fickle, and oftentimes we're interested in our attention span can be short, and we're moving on to the next new thing. It's just part of the beast that we're part of.
Thanks. One more question, and make sure you, gentleman over there, make sure you speak clearly so that Paula can hear you.
Yeah. Hi, Alex Stenson, Wikimedia Foundation. So the open access publishing community needed a lot of financial incentives. The whole academic research community needed a lot of small financial incentives added on to their research and their grants to adopt this open infrastructure, right? To adopt these open practices, to adopt these shared practices. Are there signs of that showing up in the museum space? I know, like, my background's mostly libraries, so I know that's happening a lot there, but a lot of the projects I've seen in museums, there's not that added bit of capacity or incentive attached to the grants that are given to these institutions to do open, to do shared.
Paula, did you hear that?
Partly. So I'm sorry, the last 3 questioners have been a little bit unclear audio-wise, so apologies.
Any one of you would like to answer that? Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to it in a systemic way, but at the Crest Foundation, we have supported that operationalizing that within a museum. And one example is a number of years ago, we funded a Wikipedian in residence at the Brooklyn Museum. and this was it was kind of a controversial thing for us to do because we're so invested in deep scholarship and expertise in some way, but it also felt like the right thing to do. I mean, and the issue that it was, whatever, 5 years ago, it would not be now at all. I mean, that's how much things have shifted. But we felt like it was important to support the museum in that way, but also support the field more largely by planting a flag there.
Thank you. Well,
And I think, you know, our grant agreements, we have the ability to put requirements in them, right? And so we're happy to hear from the field to say, we need you to start requiring these kinds of standards because that's going to benefit the field at large. And then we have the opportunity when we fund folks to, we can call it incentivize, we can call it require, but to say, hey, your technology has to conform to these standards that are developing within the museum field. And that helps more things get into the field that have those standards embedded in them.
thank you.
Lisa, Chris, Paula, thank you very much. Thank you for coming this morning. This is a really great discussion. Thanks.